Okay, great to be with you. My name is Michael Manuelak. I'm a professor at the Norman Patterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. Really exciting to be here with all of you. It seems like a really terrific set of discussions. Thanks, Roland and the university for setting this all up. At the previous panel, Meredith wanted everybody to feel more pessimistic and depressed about the state of our trading relationships. Hopefully, I think all of us on this panel can maybe do the reverse, and we can finish on a more optimistic note. I've already circulated a couple of questions to our panelists, and they're going to give us all the solutions for the current conundrums facing the world, because on the surface it doesn't seem like a very inspiring or optimistic moment in global environmental governance, but perhaps we can get there with our esteemed panelists. Put simply, if countries, the state of global climate governance, and we're just a few weeks away from a COP meeting, and so this will all be in the news and in focus. If countries are, meet their current climate commitments, we're looking at 2.6 to 3.1 degrees of warming, according to the UN Environment Program. And we have now very much, since those projections and since most of those commitments were taken, we've entered the world of drill, baby, drill. And so we may not necessarily be on pace to meet those commitments even within our own country. We've seen a rollback of some of the climate commitments that the previous Liberal government had made, and we've seen nothing necessarily that has been put forward to take their place. And so, and I think that we're not unique in the world in which many countries are facing some of the challenges of actually meeting these commitments. So we're going to go through. We have each of our panelists are going to provide some opening remarks. I've been instructed to be very strict in keeping them to 7 to 10 minutes. So I've got my timer here, and I will be, and I'll keep them on track, and then we'll go through 3 rounds of questions. The first is really to diagnose the current state of the current situation facing global climate politics and the planet. Then we'll talk about the institutional context, some of the mechanisms and agreements, whether we maybe are assessing the furniture that we may or may not wish to save, and then, as I said, we're going to end on an optimistic note in which our panelists are going to tell us how we can save the planet and prevent climate catastrophe. And so we're very fortunate to have 3 excellent panelists. I'm not going to go into their bios. They're all in the program which you all have. We have Jessica Green on, who's Jessica, if you can't see us, you're huge behind us. You sort of overseeing everything, which is fantastic. We have Ryan on my left, and we have Daniel on my right. I've told them all that we'll go in alphabetical order by last name, so I believe it's Jessica will lead us off.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, wonderful. I'm sorry that I can't be with you in person, but obligations kept me here in Toronto today, but I'm thrilled to be joining you via the latest technologies, harkening back to the days of COVID. So I wanted to start my remarks today just to give a quick overview of some of the arguments that are in my forthcoming book called Existential Politics, why global climate institutions are failing and how to fix them. And I hope that it is a little bit of good news in some ways. So I think Michael already set it up nicely. We are clearly facing a crisis here. And I think the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC are both teetering on the brink of irrelevance. And so the question is, what do we do about it? And in the book, I argue that what we need to do really is redirect. We need to refocus our thinking about the nature of the climate crisis, less of one of managing tons of emissions in the atmosphere, and more of a problem of redirecting the flow of dollars in the global economy. And basically, I argue that we've been overly focused on the wrong problem, which is managing tons of emissions in the atmosphere. And this is the kind of the narrow construction of climate change as a problem of measuring, accounting for, trading tons of greenhouse gases. And instead, what we need to do really is think about dollars as the key metric for progress in the energy transition. And the reason we need to focus on dollars is for three reasons. One, it responds to multiple overlapping crises. I mean, obviously today you're talking about not just the problem of the climate crisis, but the many challenges facing the liberal international order. So a focus on dollars, and I'll say more about what that means in a minute, will address issues like global inequality and rising populism. It will help provide immediate material benefits to folks that will be affected by the climate crisis. Whereas when we focus on tons through things like carbon pricing or net zero, either people are adversely affected, right, because they have to pay more at the pump, or they don't really understand what it means to be net zero or to have a good carbon footprint. These are very sort of abstract ideas. And the most important reason that we need to focus on dollars is because we've really ignored, the climate regime to date has ignored the elephant in the room, which is obstructionism by fossil asset owners. So fossil fuel companies, obviously, but mining companies, heavy industry, all of these carbon intensive industries that have a vested interest in slowing decarbonization policy because it's going to hurt their bottom line. I mean, this isn't rocket science, but to date, what the climate regime has done is focused more on how do we manage tons rather than how do we deal with this obstructionism and how do we build up green asset owners in this new decarbonized economy. And so there are a few ways I think that we can do this, and apologies, Michael, if this is jumping ahead, but I did give you a preview of my comments. So there are a few ways I think that I talk about in the book that we can think about how to think about dollars as the key metric for climate ambition rather than tons. One is tax law. So I have argued at length in a number of places that tax policy is climate policy. We need to think about wealth inequality as a huge driver of climate change. So the carbon inequality report that is issued from Oxfam each year has found that 10% of the world's population is responsible for more than half of the carbon added to the atmosphere between 1990 and 2015. So we need to deal with those people. We also need to think about how the extent to which multinational corporations offshore their profits. They move them to places where corporate tax rates are lower, and in so doing, deprive the state of much needed revenue. And how does this relate to climate change? Well, in a couple of ways. One, it helps make polluters pay their fair share in taxes. Two, it gives additional revenue to the state, even if that money is not used for green purposes or for decarbonization. It helps them pay the bills on any number of ways. And three, it helps reduce the material wealth and political entrenchment of fossil asset owners, which is a key part of the problem. So a tax law is a critical way that we can think about climate policy. I'm happy to report that Canada has been a good citizen and fully implemented the new OECD rules on a corporate minimum tax of 15%. And this will help, I think, further the global efforts on tax cooperation. There's also an international tax treaty being negotiated, and Canada has yet to contribute to that, but should definitely do so in the coming months and years. We can also think about investment law as a key way to address climate change, and I talk about how the investor-state dispute settlement system is a key tool in the arsenal of fossil asset owners as a way to protect their investments. Many of you may know that TC Energy sued the US government over the cancellation of the Keystone Pipeline. And the main reason that they lost was because CUSMA does not include ISDS provisions. These provisions in investor-state dispute settlement system basically allow investors through bilateral investment treaties to sue countries if they feel that, among other things, regulations are cutting into their investments in unfair ways. I'm conscious of the time here. So I think Canada can think about how to use the ISDS in a way to undercut the power and material wealth of fossil asset owners, not only by not using the ISDS provisions, as in the case with CUSMA, but withdrawing from ICSID, which is the home institution for ISDS. So a number of countries have already said we are no longer going to include these protection provisions in our bilateral investment treaties, and Canada could certainly follow suit. This would be a way to basically stop protecting fossil fuel assets and allow, have the full risk of these investment decisions be reflected in companies' choices to make these investments. I know you talked about trade law in the previous session, and so I don't want to go too far into this, but trade is the final lever and the big question, I think, for climate policy global climate policy going forward. I think middle powers, including Canada, now face a huge choice, right? Now that the international trading system is essentially in shambles. One is to wait out the Trump administration and hope that things go back to normal. Two is to seek out new regional trading partners. And three is to build some kind of bilateral or regional or multilateral relationship with China, without whom full decarbonization will not be possible. And I think that this is a really critical, this is possibly the most important piece of climate policy going forward. We know that autarky or closed supply chains are not an option for decarbonization at the rate that we need to decarbonize at this point to avoid the worst effects of the climate crisis. And they're not great for they're not a great time horizon for politicians either. So, for example, Doug Ford, our premier, has this vision for a full supply chain for EVs, from critical minerals to production. But this process is contingent on building 4 roads, none of which is yet under construction, and will likely be further delayed by challenges from environmental advocates and from indigenous communities. So autarky is not really a possibility. We need to really think about how we are going to reorient our trade partnerships with other countries, particularly China. And then I just want to say a final word on the Paris Agreement. What is the furniture that we save here? I think from these previous comments that there are a lot of ways that we can think about focusing on dollars as the key mechanism for climate policy going forward, rather than focusing on tons. So I don't think we should see the UNFCCC as the locus for climate policy. It is one of many, and it shouldn't be the major one either. It can remain the institutions where countries report their national efforts. Transparency can sometimes help shame laggards. It's also important for countries to gather raw data about emissions. But it's not going to be the engine of decarbonization, precisely because it's not going to address this 800-pound gorilla, which is the political and material power of fossil asset owners. The Paris Agreement can also, and the UNFCCC can also be the place for ancillary funding on mitigation and adaptation. But even this is a drop in the bucket. So the largest financial mechanism in the Paris Agreement is the Green Climate Fund, which has disbursed only $6 billion since its first projects were funded in 2015. By contrast, last year at COP29 in Baku, developing countries were asking for $1.3 trillion per year. So this is really, it's helpful a little bit, but it's not where the real action is at in terms of making the energy transition quickly. So we really need to think about shifting our expectations away from the UNFCCC and instead thinking about how we reroute the flow of dollars in the global economy, both to strip away regulatory and financial protections for fossil asset owners, but also to build up green asset owners through new trade arrangements. And really the only way that Canada and other countries do this is through a more muscular state, right? Both domestically and internationally. And this is really, we need to think about much more active engagement in green industrial policy at the domestic level and much more active engagement with new trading partners to really disseminate green technology as quickly as possible. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for starting that panel off, Jessica. I'm really looking forward to your book, and I wish I had a copy of it before this panel so I kind of mined it for answers to these really, tough questions. Okay, I want to start with a pretty embarrassing confession, and that is that I actually miss George W. Bush. So I never in a million years thought that I would say that. When he was elected, I thought that the world had ended. He was not a particularly good president. There was so much to criticize about, his melange of neoconservatism and neoliberal economic policy. But here we are. The coming to power twice now of Donald Trump and the associated upending of democratic norms and rational policy debates makes me kind of pine, to be honest, for those comparatively good old days when debates about between political conservatives and liberals was about what makes for good policy, rather than a debate about what even constitutes reality, or a debate about how to engage in politics, a debate about how to treat your allies and your adversaries. And so that's why I miss the George W. Bush years. So that might seem like a strange way to start a contribution to a panel about climate governance, but I'll come back to it. We've been asked to identify what cooperative structures from the rules-based international order might be salvaged, adapted, or built anew in relation to climate change. And there are numerous directions we could go in here. We could try to salvage or retool the very process of climate governance itself, the Paris architecture, if you will. And this was, as we've heard, the agreement that the Trump government has pulled out of twice now. And there are real questions about its legitimacy, particularly, of climate governance, particularly in the absence of the world's largest contributor to global warming to date. That said, while the U.S.'s absence in this process does leave a significant hole at the table, it's still worth pursuing multilateral cooperation on climate change. And this doesn't just mean the large, comprehensive global efforts like the Conference of the Parties of the UNFCCC. It could also include bilateral, small group, international cooperation, coalitions, building new coalitions, sharing best practices and ideas, little trade groups, so on and so forth. By the same token, we could try to salvage climate finance. We heard a little bit about that from Jess. And we could try to, in particular, provide development finance to impoverished economies. This, however, was always a fraught and deeply inadequate structure, but it did mobilize billions of dollars of development financing, much of which is now in jeopardy. In fact, the United States has rescinded billions of dollars in financing for climate initiatives and adaptation. So we should indeed seek to salvage those investment dollars. We could try to salvage climate science. There's no shortage of examples of the Trump administration's attack on scientific integrity and the scientific process. With regards to climate change, there's tons of examples, defunding scientific data collection efforts, a constant stream of misinformation about wind power and coal, clean coal, and a recent effort to commission a revisionist climate science report from the U.S. government, from the Energy Secretary, essentially as part of an effort to repeal the EPA's so-called endangerment finding. This is the regulation that kind of states that CO2 is a pollutant. And so we should salvage climate science, particularly by funding it here in Canada and outside the US. So yes, salvage climate multilateralism, salvage climate development financing, and salvage climate science. But I think what I'd like to spend the rest of my time talking about today is something much more fundamental and rudimentary, which is salvaging what we might call climate reason. Climate reason might be defined as a rational political and economic discussion about the costs and benefits of climate change and about society's capacity to mitigate risks. And it's certainly tied to climate science, it's tied to finance and cooperation, but I think it operates at a more fundamental level, a level really required for discussion about all those other things. And I think the locus of where climate reason needs to be salvaged most is the United States. When the president of the world's largest economy, and the country, again, most responsible for global warming to date, says things like climate change is a hoax, when he confuses climate and weather, when he jokes about having more oceanfront property thanks to rising sea levels, which incidentally is a logical fallacy because rising sea levels actually reduce the amount of land area, land perimeter. When his energy secretary expresses skepticism about whether human activities even have a role in the climate, when his energy secretary suggests that renewable energy is, quote, essentially worthless because of its intermittency, these irrational claims are made persistently for years upon years. It's a huge problem for climate reason. And the reason why is it gives a permissive structure for corporate actors, other states, institutions, and of course tens of millions, if not more, of social media users and bots and real people alike to whittle away further and further at climate reason. And so we go from having this rational discussion about costs and benefits, about the best way to mitigate risks and trade-offs, to having a discussion that's completely unmoored from reality, about cognizant of the risks ahead of us, and it's unproductive. So don't get me wrong, if we go back to the Bush junior years, in the early 2000s, there was a lot of climate BS, for lack of a better word. There was skepticism in there. There was baloney, like the promotion of clean coal. There was hype in it, proposals that were kind of silly, like around corn ethanol and, the hydrogen economy. There was an expansion of oil and gas production during his years, and there was obfuscation at the international table. But at the end of the day, you could sit down with the administration's officials and have a debate founded on reason. And I think this is why by, Bush's 2007 State of the Union address, he said, quote, "We must confront the serious challenge of global climate change." And incidentally, it was during Bush's tenure that US GHG emissions peaked and began to decline, although I think we need to give, some props to the global financial crisis for lending a helping hand on that front. So I'd like to spend my final minute or two on what is to be done about climate reason. How do we restore climate reason? How do we salvage it? And, while this is an impossible question to answer, as a political economist, I'm going to suggest maybe two approaches we might take, one strategic, one normative. The strategic approach is to try to align our climate objectives with the Trump administration's own incentives. So, one example here might be framing clean energy development and even international energy investments in developing economies as a geostrategic battle that the US is currently losing with China, losing to China, right? So you securitize clean energy development. You emphasize how China's winning the global clean tech race. You note that China's winning over large portions of Africa through its development financing, and it's losing, which is allowing it access to critical minerals. And you leverage this with the fact that the Trump administration is keen to spend billions of dollars on industrial domestic policy, which in theory could be put towards the next generation of clean tech. So that's the strategic approach, but I think it's somewhat ethically dubious. And so another approach is a normative one, where you focus on, and this gets to my comments earlier today, you really focus on salvaging American democracy. And this, category of solutions basically involves doing whatever possible to avoid the descent into whatever pseudo-fascist rabbit hole Donald Trump is currently leading the US down. I don't know how you do this, especially from outside the United States, though in principle the focus should be on pushing back against oligarchy, pushing for the democratization of wealth, supporting fundamental rights and freedoms, and protecting an independent judiciary and media environments. Perhaps from a Canadian policy perspective, this could maybe include getting language in a trade agreement, if that ever comes down the pipe, supporting these ideals of freedom, democracy, electoral fairness, and so on, which are all things that the Trump administration seems to support, at least in word. So I think in the interest of time, I'll leave it there and look forward to discussing more. Thanks.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you so much. In my opening remarks, I would like to share some key insights from a recent paper of ours, co-authored with my colleagues Mathieu Blondil and Philippe Podberg from Vrije Universiteit, which was published a few weeks ago in Global Policy. Today we heard a lot about the big picture, and I will go into a little bit into specifics, but I hope what we could learn through this project and Navigator and through the specific research can be also useful to the general discussions on how to save the furniture. So this paper examines the global architecture of carbon pricing, and we did this by systematically mapping, analyzing the institutions, governance initiatives, and programs that shape carbon pricing at the global level. So we came from a more optimistic approach. We thought that it was worth doing this mapping exercise. And our idea was simple. We can only propose meaningful reforms in this ecosystem once we understand exactly how it is constructed. And fragmentation and complexity are given, of course, but we know very little how decisions are made and which actors are most influential. There is no common understanding whether the UNFCCC is really an increasingly irrelevant actor, as Jessica said, or still the most important venue for decision making, for example. And carbon pricing has become the cornerstone of climate action, but it's often at the center of political debate. Just think about the recent backtracking on a carbon tax in Canada, but also the recent proposal from the European Commission that would allow member states to meet part of their emission reduction targets through international carbon credits. It's a highly controversial issue, to say the least. Carbon pricing, of course, is not the only instrument of climate governance, but I believe it's a revealing one. It shows both the progress and the challenges of international climate cooperation. On the one hand, mechanisms such as emission trading system, carbon taxes, and voluntary carbon markets are proliferating across the globe. And this expansion reflects both the maturity of the idea and its perceived efficiency. But it also shows how the Paris Agreement bottom-up structure has encouraged experimentation and diffusion. And it is a plus point, I would argue, for international organizations, since there is plenty of empirical evidence showing that the Paris Agreement was instrumental in global expansion of carbon pricing. On the other hand, this governance architecture is increasingly fragmented, hybrid, and contested, especially voluntary carbon markets, which is just to know when corporations finance emission reduction projects in third countries, mostly global south countries, and claim corresponding emission reductions through their own net zero claims, and the international equivalent of voluntary carbon markets is the international emission trading, which is discussed in Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. So voluntary carbon markets dominate this transnational landscape, but they are challenged by persistent doubts about environmental effectiveness. And lastly, the new geopolitical dynamics, especially the rapid expansion of carbon pricing in the BRICS countries, will be reshaping the field and also raising questions about whether these global markets will converge or fragment further. And let me briefly share the 4 most important findings of our paper. First, the global governance of carbon pricing has expanded rapidly, especially since the Paris Agreement. Over 40% of the initiatives in our data set were launched in just the past 4 years. Second, there's a really strong global North dominance. 87% of initiatives are headquartered in North America or Europe. And this figure is even higher for voluntary carbon markets, where only 2 regional initiatives are based in Africa. Yet, Sub-Saharan Africa and East Asia are becoming increasingly important regions for project implementation and capacity building activities. Third, the governance system is highly polycentric and hybrid. We find significant overlap in functions, with initiatives often combining public, private, and civil society actors. About 65% of voluntary market initiatives are privately launched and managed by firms. So it shows how firms are increasingly active in this ecosystem. And crucially, voluntary carbon markets initiatives play a disproportionately large role in global carbon pricing governance. And this is the fact despite generating far less revenue than compliance markets, $2 billion versus $100 billion, and also widespread questions about the integrity. And finally, the UN, World Bank, and the EU emerged as central hubs. Each anchors a cluster of initiatives with different divisions of labor, but also overlapping activities. So this fragmented and polycentric structure raises very important questions about effectiveness, legitimacy, and equity, what we discussed today. Just consider voluntary markets. The rapid growth is part of response to the shortcomings in the clean development mechanism and Article 6. Negotiating Article 6 of the Paris Agreement is still not finalized. It's been taking 9 years. And the UNFCCC still lacks a strong methodological framework to regulate them. So the proliferation of these private-led initiatives is a direct result of the failure of UNFCCC process. The second important questions about legitimacy and the UN, World Bank, and the EU being the most influential actors is whether developing countries trust the EU and its institutions as brokers of global carbon pricing markets. And given the criticism received for the CBAM, this is not an obvious answer. And second, important is that demands for equity and legitimacy are intensifying. So we conducted interviews with policymakers across the globe, and many African policymakers, for example, argue that the current markets primarily serve developed countries' interests. Offset projects often involve land grabbing, rights violations, and limited local benefits. And today we discussed a lot about middle powers. And we would argue that showing an appealing development path for these countries and implementing, for example, high integrity projects is not just a normative question, but also political necessity, because we have to bring them along the journey of to climate neutrality, especially the EU is competing with China in this very field. And there is geopolitics, the elephant in the room. Carbon pricing is expanding rapidly in the BRICS countries. China just introduced last week that they will introduce an absolute cap in the emission trading system. It basically means that they expect the emissions peaking in the near future. India and Brazil adopted legislation to introduce carbon pricing this year. And even Russia recently launched its first carbon credits, which was sold through United Arab Emirates investment platform. And we think that the key uncertainty here is whether this system will connect with Western markets or remain isolated for geopolitical reasons. We believe that there's a huge market opportunity to open up for Western markets, but if this fragmentation remains in place, then these separate carbon registries can proliferate, and this can drive further fragmentation and inconsistency. But we also argue that this geopolitical rebalancing provides ample opportunity for broader legitimacy and alignment, as well as tensions. So this is for the opening. Thank you so much.
A lot of really good I'm not going to say much.
Oh, it's for those.
Okay, great, thanks. All right. Yeah, great. Lots of different perspectives and different angles. Wanted to get first to the diagnosis portion of this, and there was a little bit of that. I think a little bit of all of your responses to all the questions I'm going to ask. But what is the state of global climate governance? I described a fairly perhaps depressing context. Within, in terms of efforts to mitigate climate change. We've talked, I think, a little bit about adaptation, not much on loss and damage too. But am I right in kind of, in my assessment that there's been a significant loss of momentum in global climate governance? If so, perhaps describe that loss of momentum. What factors do you think are reshaping that cooperative context? We'll start in the same order as we had before with Jessica.
Well, there was a piece in the New York Times last week by David Wallace Wells, who wrote The Uninhabitable Earth, who said, basically everybody has now soured on climate action, and it's not just the United States. And I think you could argue, actually, as a longtime observer of multilateralism in the climate space, that we've never really been hot to trot on decarbonization policy. We've spent many, many years sort of kicking the can down the road. And the thing that's changed is perhaps less the fact states' policies and more the realities of the climate crisis have arrived. We've certainly made some progress, and a lot of that is due to China's 3 decades of industrial policy, investing in renewables and making them cheaper for everybody. And the European leadership, I think, is also another key element of the progress that we've made thus far. But I think I don't think we've ever had a good command, a good handle on this problem in the multilateral space. And that's maybe a bit controversial. There's always been a multilateral process, but I mean, if you look at the Kyoto Protocol, it essentially fell apart after a number of developed countries were going to either miss their targets or were going to miss their targets and withdrew, including Canada. And then there was a period of sort of angst and dawdling between Kyoto and the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement, even when it was passed in 2015 or, signed in 2015, there were a lot of people who said this isn't enough and it's not going to fly. And I think, the chickens have come home to roost on that one. That I think a lot of, while it addressed some of the institutional problems of the Kyoto Protocol, it created a whole new set of problems and really gave states a lot more leeway to be non-cooperators or under-cooperators in the climate space. So maybe that's a bit of a controversial take, but I don't think we've really ever done well on climate since the sort of beginning days of multilateralism. It's just that the problems have gotten a lot worse.
Great, thank you. Ryan?
Not sure that's a controversial argument, at least on this panel. I guess we'll see. So the question is, has there been a loss of momentum? And I think we'll probably see at COP30, it'll be a really good, kind of arbiter of that question. That's going to happen this November in Brazil. The degree, again, to which global climate governance is even just keeping it together, let alone, maintaining momentum. There's also actually an upcoming climate summit this week, actually, starting this Wednesday in New York City, organized by the UN Secretary General. 109 countries participating. The US is not one of them. One interpretation, I think, is that the international community right now is basically saying, look, we've been in this situation before with Trump 1.0. The show must go on. And, despite the fact that we're missing one of the central characters of the cast, and so that's what we're going to do. And if you look at the UNFCCC website, you wouldn't know that there's this gaping hole. There's nothing about the U.S. not being involved. It kind of just looks like business as usual with the common ramping up of this cooperative dialogue from the COP host country in the months leading up to COP, really seeking to start to push countries to ramp up ambition at this upcoming meeting, which it's framing as pivotal. So this year they're doing this thing called the NDC 3.0. This is when NDC, National Determined Contributions, require, this year, member states of the UNFCCC are required to really submit plans that ratchet up ambition, and it's in the context of this recent global stocktake report that was put together, which showed that the world isn't on track to meet the UNFCCC's or the Paris Agreement's targets of limiting global warming to far below 2 degrees Celsius. Just as a measure of where we are currently, we're set to breach that 2-degree threshold sometime between 2030 and 2050. And the sooner that occurs, the more we are likely to warm above 2 degrees Celsius, and the harder it will be to stabilize global temperatures, right? If you think about that emissions reduction curve required to stabilize global temperatures, to halt global warming, it gets steeper and steeper the more we warm. So to connect this back to what I was saying earlier, I would say, one, global climate governance appears to be, for now, weathering the absence of the U.S., somewhat like a soccer team weathers, the absence of one of its key players after losing getting a red card. Two, global climate governance, kind of along the lines of what Jess said, it's never really been transformative. Three, if we really want it to be transformative, whether that's in the context of its existing kind of mechanisms or in something radically different, like maybe something along the lines of what Jeff said earlier, either way, we really need the U.S. to be at that table. They need to be a participant in some capacity. And finally, there's a danger that if the U.S. continues down this current trajectory, this political trajectory towards, let's just call it authoritarianism, that's the trajectory, we really risk losing not just the U.S., but other nations and other actors to this kind of failure of climate reason, and that will only make it harder to achieve the kind of effective global climate governance that is needed to halt global warming. Thanks.
Yeah, I believe that the picture is a bit mixed, and it's not that bad as we like to talk about. I mean, we have to put things into perspective. Global climate action and the policies that have been introduced by countries have never been sufficient to tackle the problem. But we also have to see that there was a significant expansion and growth of policies and ambition in the last couple of years. Just getting back to carbon pricing, currently 28% of global emissions are covered by carbon pricing, which is in a stark contrast of 2020 when this coverage stood at 15%. So I think that's a remarkable expansion and diffusion. And this also should suggest that climate governance continues to expand. It is also empirically shown in our paper where we see 40% of all the initiatives have been launched in the last 4 years. But of course, we have to admit that the quality and ambition of these mechanisms remain inadequate. To the question whether we have a genuine loss of momentum, I would argue that the momentum hasn't been lost or disappeared, but shifted in form. Of course, now we see currently a backlash, especially in the EU, not to mention what's happening in the US. But I think this interest just dispersed across multiple venues, such as national systems, more voluntary carbon markets, regional cooperatives, and transnational partnerships. And I think the role of China is interesting here. So, for example, Xi Jinping made some really remarkable observations and and sharing some of the strategies they would like to see happening in the multilateral organizations such as the UNFCCC. So we see a backtrack in Western world, but it's not necessarily true in developing countries. I mentioned India and Brazil and Indonesia all adopting some ambitious policies on their respective level. And the factors that are shaping the cooperative context currently, I think first is of course geopolitical fragmentation, so the rivalries between major powers, how we think about the relationship with China, which makes energy transition and climate transition affordable by developing clean tech technologies, or see it as a major competitor. I think this discussion is still open, for example, at EU level. And on the kind of more negative side is the EU CBAM, which illustrates how climate measures can generate serious tensions rather than cooperation. My personal view is that, for example, the CBAM, the political cost of CBAM surpassed the economic benefits easily. The second is what I mentioned, the greater demands for equity and legitimacy. Developing countries insist that climate policies must not deepen inequalities, and currently in carbon markets, this is invisible in concerns over integrity and land rights and other violations, and the general view about lack of fairness in these projects. The third one is institutional complexity. We, for example, identified 70 different initiatives in carbon pricing governance. This can encourage experimentation and diffusion, as we see for carbon pricing, but also it overwhelms capacity and weakens coherence. We see several overlaps in governance functions between the EU and the World Bank, for example. And the last one is crisis intensification. As climate impacts accelerate, urgency grows, but urgency doesn't automatically translate into cooperation. It can also fuel short-termism and nationalism, and I think this point also speaking to the point that was made in the previous panel, what can happen if for example, the trade war has some really negative impacts on domestic politics in the US. Yeah.
Great, thanks. So I wanted to touch a little bit on institutions. They've come up, the UNFCCC and some of the other bodies. Are these bodies, the current cooperative architecture in the United Nations and I guess more broadly the regime complex that addresses climate change, are these fit for purpose in the current context? Global conditions are constantly changing. The climate crisis is worsening. I think all panelists have made an argument that we're not meeting the scale of the global crisis that we're facing. Is there a need for broad-based institutional change? What might that change look like? Do we need to do more to limit fragmentation in global environmental politics in general? Oftentimes we talk about fragmentation, the separation of climate from nature and biodiversity and other elements of the multilateral system. Is that one of the mechanisms that could be that could perhaps take a bigger and stronger approach to the problems that we're facing? We'll start again with Jessica, and then Ryan, and then Daniel.
Okay, thanks. This is a great discussion. So on this question of what institutions do we need, I think the answer to that question depends on what you think the problem is, right? And so to date, we've thought that the problem is, there's too much CO2 in the atmosphere. And I think that the problem is actually a political economic problem of basically how do you convert to the extent that you can, how do you convert fossil assets to green assets? How do you stop the political obstructionism of fossil assets that can't be converted and their owners, right? And so I think so we need to think, before we answer the question of what institutions do we need, I think we need to ask ourselves, what is the problem, right? Is this a problem of carbon lock-in? Is this a problem of cooperation and free riding? Or is this a problem of what I think it's a problem of existential politics, of this fundamental conflict between different types of asset owners? So I think that's one piece. A second answer to this question, I think, is we need to really remember that the proliferation of institutions does not equal progress. And this is a pattern that I've seen over and over in my research, right? While we've seen a proliferation of now 28% of all carbon emissions are covered by a carbon price, and yet emissions are still going up, and most emissions trade for less than $5 a ton. We've seen, there's now 30 plus standards that govern net zero. And yet we know that that governments are now legislating what kinds of claims companies can make, because so many of these standards really don't mean very much. So we see a lot of proliferation of institutions, both governmentally and intergovernmentally, and private forms of regulation. And just because they proliferate doesn't mean that they're doing anything. And in fact, often what they do is distract from the problems at hand, because then everybody gets very busy coordinating and making sure that these are not in conflict and so on and so forth. And we get further and further from the fundamental problem of how do we deal with obstructionism, and how do we deal with this problem of stranded assets, and how do we convert fossil assets like car manufacturers, how do we create the incentives for them to flip to become EV manufacturers, right? So I think that's another key point that we need to keep in mind. And to the extent that you think, as I do, that this is a fundamental problem of existential politics, we need very different institutions, right? We don't need the UNFCCC, UNFCCC, or UNUP. As I talked about a little bit in my remarks, we need to think about trade institutions, and we need to think about sort of how do we manage geopolitical conflicts. Like, there are some people who have talked about this growing schism between, petrostates and electrostates, or, the rise of China as the new climate hegemon, right? And so to the extent that we think that this is really what's going on, then, we need bilateral agreement. We need the G2 or the G7 or maybe the G20 to think about how do we align countries geopolitically in ways that foments trade, because we need this moment of autarky is been well shown to be antithetical to the diffusion of clean technologies that we need to decarbonize, right? So if we're going to do that quickly, we need the global trading system back. We need China. We need to stop doing silly things like putting 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs because we're afraid about China becoming the global hegemon in clean technology. That ship has already sailed. And so I think, Ryan's comments are right on, in that we need to think about the economic incentives, and how do we align our own economic incentives with other countries that are technological leaders. And that's going to be tax law, trade law, investment law. We have institutions for that, and some of them are working pretty well, because many of them are not in the realm of high politics. They haven't been politicized in the same way that climate has. And so I think we need to think about those options as well. And so I guess the last thing I'll say is that fragmentation is a double-edged sword, right? Scholars love to think about fragmentation as a problem, because we wish that everything were coordinated. But there are political reasons that we split things apart, right? Because that makes the problem more tractable for negotiation purposes. So I think that's kind of one reason that, Naomi Klein wrote in her book 10 years ago, This Changes Everything, that the trade and climate regimes were negotiated at the same time in parallel, precisely. And it's not that, negotiators couldn't figure out that these were related. It was just that linking those two things was just going to be too politically fractious. So I think we need to think about the fact that there is some political utility to fragmentation, and this idea of coordination, as I said before, can often distract us from what the real governance issues are. So we say we need to coordinate, but that may not. But I think the question is, coordinate what? And so I don't think we need more coordination. I think we need to really shift the focus of institutions that we consider climate institutions. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really good question that I perennially ask to my students, and we hear all sorts of answers on this. I think in my view, the UNFCCC seems like it still has an important role to play, but it also feels like it's just become too big. It's become this self-fulfilling, never-ending process as opposed to an agreement with a sense of finality to it. In the field of global environmental politics, we often hear about, we often teach about the Montreal Protocol, which wasn't about climate change per se, although it actually had a pretty significant impact on the climate, but it was about reducing the substances that reduce the ozone layer or deplete the ozone layer. And we often hold up the Montreal Protocol as this golden example of success in global environmental governance. And so, although there's been some recent backsliding with regards to ozone degradation, it's pretty clear that, the situation with regards to the ozone layer would be much, much worse off today without that agreement. That this protocol really was transformational, unlike climate governance, in setting the world upon a solution to that problem. And so I often think about, what it would take to the extent that we want to save global climate governance, which maybe is a question itself, but what would it take to achieve an agreement like that, but for climate change? Clearly, I think one issue right now is that the world isn't ready for that, just to be frank. Partly because of the total ubiquity of fossil fuels in energy systems today and the disproportionate power of the fossil fuel sector, as Jess has alluded. However, and maybe this is some more hopeful commentary, I don't actually think it's inconceivable to imagine a future where the share of fossil fuels in global energy systems is such that a convention organized the principle of phasing out fossil fuels, or phasing out fossil fuel combustion, I should be careful on specific words, becomes politically and economically feasible. The question is, when does that occur? At what point does that occur? So presently, non-emitting sources of energy make up about 18% of global primary energy, and that percentage is growing really fast as the share. Once it reaches, I think, around a third, this is largely guesswork, but I think there's a point that, you really start to see fossil energy systems become way more precarious from a business and investment point of view. Investment starts to dry up, the relative costs go up compared to now relatively cheaper alternatives, and all of a sudden that hegemonic hold that fossil fuels has had on energy systems potentially starts to collapse. Now, I may be somewhat deluded. There was just a recent report in Bloomberg saying that fossil fuel combustion is actually destined to grow next year and continue for the foreseeable future. But, I think we actually have a real example of when this happened. This occurred in the context of traditional biomass, which, back in 1860 made up about the same share of global primary energy that fossil fuels do today. But that was, over about 60 years ago, right? Anyway. So of course, the worry is that this just isn't going to be fast enough. It won't happen soon enough, and that's really concerning. It's not going to happen fast enough to avoid 2 degrees Celsius of warming. It's just not going to happen. So one final thing to note is that while it's true that as a collective action problem, you really do need all actors at the table, at some point, or to some degree, it's worth keeping in mind that, just 4 countries plus the EU 28, or EU 27, so that's China, the US, India, and Russia, and the EU, these 5 jurisdictions represent 2/3 of global energy use, 2/3 of CO2 emissions, and half the world's population, and I don't know what share of global fossil investment. But just getting those 5 on board, basically, is enough to be transformational. It would be transformational, and it would get the rest of the world to follow suit. So in terms of concentrating our efforts, we focus on, the actors that matter. And finally, just to link this back to what I was talking about earlier, this is, again, why I really feel that it's so important to salvage climate reason. and salvage U.S. democracy. Because if we lose that, it's only a matter of time before some of these other jurisdictions also turn away from the table, and that just makes the problem more difficult to solve. Thanks.
I would like to respond to Jessica about fundamental problems and existential politics, and I think that's really the issue here. So I fully agree with you, but I would a little bit challenge your argument that we don't need these international organizations. I think we need to tackle vested interests of fossil fuel powers domestically to make any progress. We can commit to really ambitious goals internationally. If we cannot implement it domestically, that's a huge problem. So first we have to do this work domestically. But I still see value in having these organizations and not just having, but strengthening them. For example, if we have a global agreement on climate action, and it's politically much easier to sell to the public that we need to invest in climate action to be able to comply with this global agreement. Or if we have an agreement on carbon pricing and we can implement one domestically, then we can use this opportunity to create new winners of policy. That's what you are talking about, and tear down the power of traditional fossil fuel. And how to do that? If you have a sufficiently high carbon price, for example, in the EU, then you can use the revenue to support different clean tech projects. So by doing that, you create or construct a really strong political group that benefits from these transfers. And the idea is that over time you can, by strengthening this group, you can counterweight the power of fossil fuels. So if you don't have this agreement, of course it's politically much more difficult actually to sell this domestically. So I think you have to do both, and you have to use the opportunities the current structure provides to government to dismantle the power and at the same time also create winners. And it seems that China is just much more effective in this regard, and we have to start doing it seriously. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'll just put one more question. I want to make sure we have enough time to make sure that we get a few good questions from the audience. I promised that we would leave at least this part of the discussion in a state of optimism. What can be done? Is it possible in the current context? How, if you can maybe in a couple of minutes, as simple a task as that is, if you can leave us with some concrete recommendations about what we might do to regain momentum on global climate politics, save the furniture that should be saved, and move forward to tackle this great challenge. Jessica.
How to save the climate in 2 minutes or less. I think absolutely, I agree with the previous point that a lot of this is about domestic politics. And I think in major emitting countries in the OECD, this has become climate policy has become extremely polarized. And so the less we talk about climate, the better. And I think the same principle can be applied to the international level. The less we think about, I say in the book, the problem with climate policy, global climate policy, is it's too focused on global climate policy. So I think there is furniture, it's just different furniture, right? That it's not that we need to get rid of the UNFCCC. I think for a variety of reasons, we need to keep it, not least of which has to do with justice and fairness. But I think we need to adjust our expectations about what it can actually do. And I think what it can actually do is be a place for sharing data and information and best practices, for talking about adaptation, for some ancillary funding. But it's not going to be the engine of decarbonization. To do that, We need to work both from the bottom up, i.e. from the domestic level, which obviously there's going to be a huge amount of variation across countries, and from the top down. And what the top down can do at the international level is get rid of the structural foundations of the fossil economy. We have built in to this liberal international order. It was built on a fossil economy, right? We have, the investor state dispute settlement system, the energy charter treaty. These were all built, created to ensure that the world had fossil energy. Well, we don't want that anymore. So we need to start dismantling those. And, the good thing is that a lot of that can be done unilaterally. Countries can withdraw from provisions that they don't want. Countries can start to implement taxation policy that they do want. And that doesn't necessarily require the same level of multilateral cooperation that the UNFCCC process, as it's been constructed, does. I do absolutely agree with Ryan that, there's been a lot of talk about climate clubs and mini-lateralism. There are much smaller groups of countries that could make a significant dent in the climate crisis and in reducing emissions if they agreed to do so. But thus far, that hasn't been on the menu. So I think, we really need to rethink how we construct this problem. What is this a problem of? And I think it's a problem of a political economic transition to a new set of technologies, which requires a more muscular state, and it requires destabilizing the political incumbency of fossil asset owners and investing in a green economy. Thanks.
So, there's been this long shared meme on social media, and it's actually shared commonly by both climate skeptics and climate activists, and it's of the global concentration of CO2, and you see it going up and up, year after year, and all the COP meetings with the little flags of the locations where they held are inserted on the chart, implying, the implication being that global climate governance is all talk. It's just all talk. It doesn't actually change anything materially. And, I think while there's some truth to this criticism in the sense that, again, global climate governance has not been transformational, I think we agree on that, I don't think it's fair to say that it's been totally useless in the sense that, it has played an important role in agenda setting. It does play an important role for education and awareness, and it has filtered down to some degree to the policy world, I think. I think it's also important to note that just on that meme, basically all climate scenarios, from the really terrifying ones to the ones where we somehow manage to magically keep global warming to below 1.5 degrees Celsius, all of those scenarios actually do expect global CO2 concentrations to rise from the mid-1990s through to about 2030. So that meme doesn't actually foreclose the possibility of actually transformational climate action. Anyway, two core proposals come to mind. You asked for some more hopeful stuff. One is a practical approach that's really based on the work of Simon Sharp, and he has a really interesting book that I recommend called 5 Times Faster, which essentially tries to tackle this question of how to speed up climate action. And he basically says, forget global governance, focus instead on creating the market context for really important transformational technologies in key jurisdictions, and learn from successful examples of how this occurred. So, for instance, how did Norway go from essentially zero sales of battery electric vehicles just about 14 years ago to 94% of the market for new vehicles are battery electric vehicles in just over a decade? Or how did the UK go from 40% of its power grid being powered by coal to essentially phasing out coal entirely in less than a decade? And in most cases, he says, it's about creating this right market incentives to arrive at these tipping points, which then just manifest in rapid technological change because of relative cost savings. But again, I think I'd caution that, in order to see something like this in the US, you'd need to find some way to really align those incentives with the current administration's objectives. If I have 1 minute, I want to propose something rather crazy and just to spice up the discussion. If we want to talk about speeding up?
Well, how can we resist that?
Okay. So I'm going to put something, again, just to spice up the discussion. You could try something like backing up an international scientific effort in geoengineering. And I say that somewhat, cautiously, as there are tons of risks involved here. And the geoengineering tool that most scientists turn to for cooling the Earth from a conceptual point of view is spraying sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere. It's very unlikely to work in geopolitical terms, not least because of the kind of discussions and conspiracy theories around chemtrails that we're seeing in the US and the Trump administration. But perhaps if you sought a scientific experiment through the International Maritime Organization, brought a coalition of nations along the way, to conduct something along the lines of a marine cloud brightening to kind of adjust the effect that has occurred from its own policy in 2020 to reduce sulfate aerosols, which caused a reduction in clouds over the dark ocean, which has increased or reduced Earth's albedo. There could be some interesting results. And, within academia, there's a lot of concern that this could actually increase geopolitical tensions, and that it could serve as a moral hazard for the fossil fuel sector. But I think we might want to also think about this in terms of the risks that it potentially avoids. It could actually be the opposite. It could successfully serve as a catalyst to further action and speed up action on climate change. It could work against hopelessness and apathy. So I put it out there as a controversial idea, but I think it's something that is coming down the pipe no matter what. This is a discussion around geoengineering that is going to become more and more on the forefront of the discussion of climate governance, and we need to be prepared for it.
Yeah, conscious of time, maybe I would rather give actually my time to the public to ask questions. I already covered most of my recommendations anyway.
So let's open it up to the floor for questions. I think we've got Lillian, and maybe we can take one more, and then we'll answer from there.
I have just two very brief questions. Number one, with respect to the climate change summit in New York on Wednesday, to which, what's the point, and what's the most likely deliverable out of it, other than as a scene setter for the COP in Belém? My second question is, we now have a prime minister who, prior to becoming prime minister, was engaged with various environmental projects, including, I think, being a special rep for the UN, I think, on climate finance. How could or should this inform his approach to climate policy for Canadians? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Steve. I'm a research scholar from the APF. So my question, I hate to be the pessimist, but I have to bring it back to a trade-off. So as a Western country, how do you kind of square the circle between your own green industrial policy and proliferating the green energy trade with China? Because there's an admission, at least by the central government in China, that its own price wars and subsidies at the heart of its own green industrial policy isn't fiscally responsible. So there's a real chance that might slow down as well. And with the timelines that we're talking about, there's inevitably going to have to be a trade-off about that, whether we'll have to abandon our own green industrial policy to proliferate the green energy trade with China or other, catalyst countries in this respect. Would we have to choose between ethics, or would we have to abandon green industrial policy, or should we continue on as per how we're doing it now?
Would any of our panelists like to tackle either or both of those questions?
Well, go for it, Jess. No, I was going to turn it over to you because I don't have a fully formed thought, and I'm almost wondering if you can contextualize more this idea of why there would necessarily be a trade-off, or what kind of trade-off you have in mind. Yeah, I was intrigued by an earlier comment about tariffs on Chinese green tech, and in particular the example of tariff on electric vehicles. maybe there's a trade-off, maybe this is what you're getting at, there's a trade-off there in the sense that we are charging a huge premium on technology which could be potentially transformative for the transport sector in terms of reducing emissions, and it's being approached from this kind of protectionist and also securitized framework, concerned about Chinese imports to Canada. Maybe that's what you're getting at. But that is a really interesting policy dilemma. Like, to what extent do you protect nascent auto industries and concern yourself with these potential security concerns, and to what extent do you kind of use this as an opportunity to bring in cheap electric vehicles, which bring down the price for electric vehicles across the entire sector. And that's a difficult question. So maybe that was what you were getting at.
Jessica, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just kind of build on the last question, and I think those were Ryan's comments. Yeah, I don't see. So I guess I don't see it as an either or of, is it their EVs or our EVs? Is it their technology or our technology? I think we have a lot of work to do on understanding what is green industrial policy and knowing that it will vary by country, because green industrial policy is basically how do you steer the economy, and every country's economy has different strengths and weaknesses. I think what we tend to think about in OECD countries is like making green stuff. But the supply chain is very long, and there's lots of different pieces of it. So I highly recommend Jonas Nam's book, Collaborative Advantage, in which he talks about how Chinese and German firms collaborated to kind of improve the efficiency and decrease the costs of production for wind turbines, and that the different pieces of the technology are created in different places, and specialization happens at different sort of spots in the supply chain. And so I think there's a lot of problem solving that has to be done, where individual firms kind of figure out what their collaborative advantage is, like where they can, it's not that we all sort of reinvent the wheel, as it were, but that we figure out what we can do best with our existing, is kind of retrofitting our existing capabilities. And so I think that's a hard question, because it's very specific to individual sectors and individual countries. But I guess my response would be sort of similar to Ryan's, is that I don't see it necessarily as a trade-off. I think maybe in the short term, there's going to be some trade-off. But in the medium term, we have to think sort of more strategically about what it is that we can and cannot produce domestically. I hope that helps answer the question.
Do you want to come in, Daniel?
Yeah, just really quickly. So I think we are still trying to figure out how to reconcile these two things. In the EU, we introduced tariffs to buy some time. But I think there are a couple of lessons we could learn from the Chinese development of green tech. First, we need much more state intervention. So it was a very naive idea that we introduce carbon pricing, and this low price will actually generate these new ideas and different innovations in the market. This just didn't happen, and the Chinese state was much more proactive and in this field. But it's not only about public subsidy, right? There's also competition and innovation policy involved in China. So actually we can learn a lot from this. Especially we have to revise, for example, the rules around state aid in the EU, which is prohibited. Thank you.
Yeah, we didn't really get to the UN meetings. Does anybody, and also the Prime Minister and his background, does anybody want to come in on Lillian's question?
I can jump in on this real quick, because I I spent a lot of time studying kind of voluntary efforts, not unlike the Net Zero Banking Alliance, which was the brainchild of Prime Minister Carney. I think I'm not sure how to put this diplomatically. I think, his transition to being the leader of Canada shows the power of the fossil fuel industry, right? That when he was on the outside, kind of as a special envoy and championing these kind of voluntary efforts, he was very enthusiastic. But when he's had to face the difficult challenges of governing, he's seen the power of the fossil fuel industry, and that's come through in a lot of different policies and pronouncements that he's made in his short term as prime minister. So how his experience should inform his climate policy is a very different question than how it actually has to date.
Come in, right?
Just on your first question about, what's the point of these, especially this upcoming climate summit, I think, one of the points is performative. I think it's fair to critique them on that. But I think the point is to really start that drumming up of cooperative discussion, of drumming up of ambition, really firing people up. And it's not just about the states, it's about civil society, really calling to the responsibilities of industry and states and other parties of the UNFCCC to get them riled up, to get that discussion front of center, to make it so that when we get to COP30, it's not just some bottom news story, or it doesn't even get to the news. It's a headline. I think that's the point. And just to get back to this idea of one of the lessons that we learned from the Montreal Protocol is that some of these, one of the benefits of these kinds of things is like kind of networking is not the right word, but there's a certain necessity of especially networking at the right echelons, and there was a lot of work done by the UNEP Secretary General at the time for the Montreal Protocol, calling up, apparently he was, brutally, just like calling up Reagan's office and being like, you have to get on board. So I think to a certain extent, there's some role there for these kinds of conferences, for behind the scenes discussions to really push people, especially policymakers, to ramp up ambition.
Yeah, thank you. So we'll take another round of questions. Many governments are also behind in putting forward their new nationally determined contributions on climate, and so I think that there's, I think that legally they're obligated to announce these NDCs by February, but I think about a quarter of governments have so far done it. Canada is one of them. But they're, I think that part of it is herding these cats and trying to push them toward making a real commitment, at least in time for the COP meeting next month. We'll take one more round in the second row.
Thanks. So my question actually relates to the kind of the domestic international interties. Has it not been a perfect storm for fossil fuel interests in the last few years? You had the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, forcing Europe to pivot quickly away from Russian gas, and Canadian companies and other companies around the world were only too eager to provide LNG, which had kind of lost the bridge fuel battle in lots of people's minds. Then the US tariffs and the shock and threats to the Canadian economy really made Canada change. I mean, lots of things made us change our focus, but now we're selling ourselves as a conventional energy superpower. You look at the 5 projects of national interest that were announced by the Prime Minister very recently, and many of them are energy projects. So how does this affect Canadian legitimacy in climate governance, the do what I say but not what I do? And then back to that phrase about like bouncing forward instead of bouncing back. How do we do that?
And you were looking for one or two more? Was there anyone else looking to deliver a question? Okay. Sorry.
Thank you. Weston from South Africa. When we talk about green energy transition and the whole business about electric vehicles, do you remember about the small matter about mining of cobalt, some other precious minerals in Congo, and the kind of human rights violations that are related to that kind of industry, child labor, is it still clean? Is that transition still clean? And the whole challenge about democratization in that country. And then you look at poverty-stricken countries like Mozambique, which have discovered lots of natural gas. And they think this could constitute like some, springboard for economic takeoff and to better their citizens' living standards. How do we convince them that they have to abandon all that and get onto this bandwagon of green energy transition? And then about Donald Trump, is he an aberration? Is he an aberration? I think even if he was to leave, there's a lot of crisis globally. You go to India, Modi, Russia, Turkey, Hungary, and all over the place. There's a crisis of leadership globally. Perhaps Trump could be too crass, too clumsy, but in Africa, he seemed to be less paternalistic, a little bit too brutally honest, and therefore he tends to garner some perverse support, if you like. And then about financing, I hear even civil society in Africa talking about financing to help developing countries to, transition from fossil fuels to green energy. Is that sustainable? Is that the correct approach? And what should be done to ensure that this financing does not end up like part of the rent extraction that we've seen before? Thank you so much.
We've just got a few minutes left. I think we have Catherine has a question, so we'll take all three, and then we'll allow each panelist to respond to which of the questions you think you can. Thanks.
Yeah, I was just going to say that's a really interesting discussion, and my question is more about kind of going back to the broader theme of today. If climate governance is not working and maybe has not actually done or accomplished as much as it ever should have, should we think about kind of more of a carrots and sticks approach? I mean, you're bringing up Norway and the EV exploding onto the market. A lot of that was targeted policies to make sure that people knew that EVs were a better choice. So like you drive in a different lane, you get a lot of tax write-offs and things like that. But should that be implemented at a global level? And how can you actually get everyone on board in such a contentious geopolitical environment? And then lastly, I would say also on this getting like the politics people to kind of be on board with it as well. I was walking on the streets of Ottawa and people said, I heard a conversation between two young men where they were talking about, well, this is happening too quickly. Like right now, we can't move away from fossil fuels because we depend on fossil fuels for everything, for plastics, everything we use. And how do you relay this sense of urgency to the youth that are facing so many crises economically, but also on the global stage? So, yeah.
Okay, so we'll go to each of the panelists. Daniel, would you like to lead us off, and then we'll go in reverse order? So perhaps any of the really excellent questions we've had, and we can go from there, and then we'll go to Ryan and then Jessica to wrap up.
Yeah, a lot of good questions. Thank you so much. Yeah, it was a perfect storm for fossil fuels, but it created a cost of living crisis, and that's what makes it actually super difficult at this point to sell more stringent climate action politically. And I think one way of convincing people to get on board with more ambitious climate action is to somehow show that it's not only about emission reduction, but much more. It's about justice. It's about having a better life, a long run, and also opportunity. So we can have better jobs, or we can have more secure environment as a society, as it's getting increasingly clear with extreme weather events or mass migration, for example, in Europe, that climate change will have an impact on our security. And I think we have to somehow show that we don't do this only for save the planet, but for many other reasons. yeah, that's probably the best I can answer.
A lot of really good questions, and it's going to be impossible to address them all, so I'll just make two final comments. And actually, the first one in relation to this question, has it been a perfect storm for fossil fuels? And I don't even think I'm answering the question that was asked, but it made me think of how, yes, it has, but it also has been a perfect storm for renewables, and in particular, solar energy. And I think that's a hopeful takeaway. Global capacity of solar energy has tripled in 5 years, So every year we kind of outdo the IEA's projections for what the expected solar energy capacity additions are, and that's a really hopeful message. And you're seeing it in other areas as well, like battery storage. And that relates to one of these last questions, which is about youth and hope and anxiety, and that's a potential message for them. And I suppose the only one other question to address is, on this question of extractives, and yes, we have a really abysmal situation with the extraction of critical minerals that go into transition. If we want to just transition, we basically have a choice. We can either have poor governance and continue to extract these resources and see continued human rights violations and child labor and so on and so forth, or we can not do those things and have climate breakdown, or we can pursue the win-win option, which is good governance and extract resources in as environmentally responsible a way as possible. There's no such thing as 100% sustainable extraction. There are going to be trade-offs, but you manage them responsibly with good governance to ensure human rights, safe labor conditions, so on and so forth. And if that's a choice, then it's a no-brainer.
Great, thanks. Jessica?
Thanks, everyone. This has been a very rich set of questions and an excellent set of answers. I'm going to try and answer sort of synthetically. What I understand from a lot of these questions is that climate change is one of a set of intersecting crises that we're dealing with. Adam Tooze has written about the poly crisis. You can call it what you want, but we're dealing with the intensifying effects of the climate crisis. We're dealing with a crisis of inequality, income inequality, and rising authoritarianism, and I think alienation of youth. And so I think we really need to think synthetically about how we can try, what are the types of interventions that will address all of these things in some way or another. And so I think bouncing forward means really addressing these things holistically. And to me, that is investing in, is a more muscular interventionist state, investing in particularly, and again, I'm speaking in the developed world. I appreciate the colleague from South Africa, his comments. I'll say one thing about them at the end. It means a more muscular state that invests in pocketbook issues, because pocketbook issues are also climate issues. When we think about the cost of energy, when we think about the cost of housing, when we think about the cost of insurance, all of those things are things that voters care deeply about. The cost of gas care deeply about. And I think they are part of a climate policy that also addresses some of these other issues that we're dealing with. I mean, I think some of Ryan's comments about how do we restore climate reason, particularly as Canada, where we can see the sort of coming wave of some of the things that are going on down south, is to address all of these things, right? People are fearful about their jobs. People are fearful about their prospects for the future. And that really has to do with how is the state going to help take care of them? And so I think we need to think about all of these things together. I wanted to just say one quick thing to the colleague about the comment about Mozambique. Mozambique actually just is Total and ENI, two energy firms, are investing in natural gas in Mozambique, and they are set to route their profits through the United Arab Emirates. But This new corporate minimum tax would essentially recoup about $2 billion for Mozambique in lost tax revenue. So this is a reason that we need to really, and I mean, that could be climate finance, that could be any kind of finance. So this is a reason that we really need to think about these kinds of financial institutions as ways to address the climate crisis. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you all. If you can join me in thanking a really excellent and enlightening panel, Ryan, Daniel, and Jessica. And thank you all for the excellent questions and a great session. Thank you.
So it falls to me and Roland to try to summarize the discussion today. I will offer 3 or 4 points, and then Roland will correct me afterwards. Before I move on, there will be a slide, I think, on up there. Yeah, they're working on it. If you scan this QR code, you will get to the Navigator webpage, and at the very bottom you can also click to join our LinkedIn page. So please do, and follow us for updates on events and publications coming out. Now, one big takeaway, at least for me, which is very, very important for us in this project, is basically that it is very important to specify the nature of the problem with multilateralism. It was very clear, I think, in the debate right now and also in the previous panels. Sometimes the problem we're discussing is not multilateralism per se, but it's in the intractable character of the problems themselves, such as climate change. And then a secondary question almost is how well do multilateral institutions function to address that problem, which is independent really of the multilateral system as such. But then there is an element of the multilateral system that is important in and of itself, which is basically keeping states talking to one another for building trust and avoiding miscommunication and developing rules and standards and so on. So that's one important aspect, I think. The other is that the cause of the problem are multiple. Inefficiencies within the system, the rise of authoritarianism, China that seeks to rewrite the rules, the Trump administration, the list goes on and on and on, funding, etc. So I think both defining the problem and identifying the causes of the problem has to take into account what the issue area in question we are talking about. And I think it's very clear from the discussion today, which we will take with us. The link between the domestic and the international has come up in all panels, and I think it's a very important one. It's more directly relevant or directly visible, I should say, in some issues than others, but it's one that is very, very important. And that links, I think, to what has been suggested throughout the day about the importance of thinking about how to nurture reason in the negotiations and deliberations that one had, in developing narratives, and in how one talks about sovereignty as being also dependent on others. And so, final point, the need to prioritize. Roland suggested interest, or was it interest, impact, success? I think it is very important to have the priorities up there, because otherwise one will just continue as it is today. And then there are certain elements of this multilateral system that are actually working quite well. I think Jonathan mentioned many of them on standards and so on. So one should not forget that some elements of this system are actually working quite well. I'll end there, I think, Roland, and hand it up to you. Thank you.
I want time to digest what was a very wide-ranging and really rich discussion, but I would just off the top of my head add to your point, or build on your point about how, in a way, the premise of the meeting was embraced and in some ways challenged throughout the course of the day. In one way that it was challenged was Jonathan and others pointing out that due to the proliferation of arrangements and their variety, that while some of the larger, higher profile institutions are clearly under strain and there's a remarkable change going on, there is a substructure of a lot of less sexy, less politically visible organizations that are essential almost as the operating system for a lot of what we do for managing interdependence, and a lot of that substructure is still there, although whether those elements can remain kind of below the political radar screen and not subject to competition over who dominates those organizations, since some powers are recognizing that there is great benefit to be had by controlling technical standards, for example. So we're seeing that kind of competition spreading. Nevertheless, it's not all a gloom and doom story, I think, is one of the points. Secondly, and paradoxically, maybe things are worse than we were even saying. Maybe we've already missed the opportunity. And so it's this weird juxtaposition of, the buses are still running, but like the planes are falling out of the sky, so how do we make sense of the transportation system overall? There's also comes out of this is the silver lining of, for organizations that are being fundamentally that are facing fundamental upheaval, like the United Nations system, that there's the opportunity not only for countries that have been free riders or partially free riders to decide that they're going to, as a group, step up and say we're going to take responsibility for this piece or that piece, but honestly, let's be honest about this. The UN has been in need of reform for so long, and it's so hard in a lot of these institutional structures to bring about change because of the vested interests that get built around them. And it's not, I say it's a silver lining because nobody would want, I think, or very few people probably in this room would want to see the kind of disruption that we're seeing now. But it is an opportunity potentially to be thinking about how these structures might be reformed. I think that the bigger, for me, sense of urgency is that whether we rate the current capacity of these multilateral structures as diminishing or stable, the scale of the problems and the number of problems that are requiring international cooperation is, multiplying at the same time. So no matter how you would place, your evaluation of like how much is the building on fire, and I'm going to lose the metaphor here, just get literal, that the requirement for cooperation is increasing so dramatically that we're still in a lot of trouble. And so our capacity for really collective action is diminishing just at a moment when we need more of it. So we have a choice. We can either get depressed and turn away from the news, which so many of our compatriots have done, and I certainly feel the temptation to do that, or we face difficult questions. And the difficult questions, I think, have to be based on the presumption that resources will be quite limited and the demands will be unlimited. And, the definition of any strategy is the allocation of intrinsically limited resources to potentially unlimited problems. And I think for that, I'm happy that this conversation, I'm happy for the Navigator project, because I think both the subject-specific panels that we had were useful for the project. I think the larger scoping discussion that we had in the morning was useful for the project, and I was very pleased that we here at the university, CIPS, and the graduate school could provide a venue for the project to have a Canadian-informed discussion. But it's also, I think, it's a really important set of issues for Canada because the budgets are going to be not growing. in this area at the very least, and maybe reduced. So we're going to have to try and do more with less or the same with less. And that's going to require tough decisions about where we're going to actually concentrate our efforts, as much as we would like to think that we could do so much more. If we don't make these decisions consciously, then we will still do things, and there will be a de facto set of priorities reflected in what we do, but they will be decisions we recognize after the fact, and we might not have the concentration of effort that we would like to see. And so I do think that here, too, there's an opportunity, because the conversation about, Canada can't join every club, et cetera, has happened for so long at such a level of abstraction and never, for a variety of reasons, punched through to, okay, so what is the actual answer to the question? Question will vary, the answer will vary, but I don't think we can escape answering that question now. And I hope very much that this conversation and many others like them will encourage and maybe to some small degree inform the discussion that we're going to have, not just as our political leaders and our public servants, but our country too, and not least because, as many people pointed out today, in order to do anything in this area, we're going to have to make the case to the public why scarce resources should be spent when other programs are probably going to be being cut. So let me just thank everyone, especially people in the room, the hardy people who stuck with us for an entire workday of interesting and important conversation. Thank you. Thank you to our presenters. Thank you to our chairs, Michael, Alexander, Meredith, who did really, all three of you, a really wonderful job of leading the conversations, and all three of you kept us right on time. I want to thank Alexander Getchu, who had to leave a little bit a while ago as the director of the Center for International Policy Studies, for committing the center to this project. What that meant was that we had the support of the center's incredible staff and all of the organizational stuff that you commented on at the outset, Uli Jakob. That professionalism is all due to them. So thank you to them for the work that they did on this project as well. I do want to thank NUPI and other partners in the Navigator project. And as I said, I hope that this conversation continues. I'm really looking forward to seeing how it's reflected in the ongoing and eventual outcomes of the Navigator project and the advice to the European Commission. Thank you. Thank you to everyone. Have a great rest of your day.